began, and they have not been that quick to respond to any of the other protests, especially when it comes to allies. So you see that that tact has not changed at all. Now, when you push the administration, do you have a double standard? Because you are, when it comes to Bahrain and when it comes to Yemen, key allies to the United States, you're pushing for reform, but you are actively, when it comes to Iran, telling the Iranian people to protest in the streets and criticizing the administration of Iran. They say that there is no double standard there, though. That's exactly what they're saying these days.
OK, Patty, stay with us. I might come back to you in just a little while. Patty Culhane in Washington, D.C. there. US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton still speaking there. One of the things that she was very strong on was the risk of a humanitarian crisis in Libya, and she talked about offering US aid and sending humanitarian teams to the Libyan borders to offer help, and even diverting US food stocks to Libya. Let's speak more about this with Tarek Youssef, who's a senior research fellow at the Dubai School of Government and joins me now in the studio. She was very keen to focus on the humanitarian effort, and of course that is the big concern at the moment.
Very significant concern. Up to 1.5 million foreign nationals, mostly from neighboring countries, both in the Arab world and in Africa, working in Libya. They're cut off from their livelihood. They're unable to access their assets. They're also caught up in the line of fire, potentially in some of the cities. They want to leave. They want to move. That's a very significant challenge, and with border crossings being risky as they are, there is the potential for a humanitarian crisis to ensue.
And it's not just the borders. I mean, you're from Benghazi.
Yeah.
Benghazi is in opposition hands, but the area around it is not. That is also still being controlled by pro-Gaddafi forces. Absolutely.
Add to it food shortages, which will only get worse possibly, and add to it cut-off of Libya and further isolation of not just Libya's regime, but potentially Libya's airports and Libya's geography and cities from the rest of the world. We've seen this in Libya before with Egyptian nationals, with Palestinians who've had to move out rather swiftly in large numbers. That presented tremendous human hardships, and that is what I think the Secretary is referring to very specifically and rightly, I would argue.
OK, Tarek, thanks very much indeed for that. We'll have a full update at the top of the hour.
Business Latest is brought to you by the Qatar Tourism Authority and Capco. Business Latest is brought to you by the Qatar Tourism Authority and Capco.
If you're a Nokia user, you can download AlJazeera's news widget from Nokia's Ovis store. The news widget, available on compatible Nokia devices, gives users quick and easy access to real-time news updates from Al Jazeera English. See the world in real time. Al Jazeera Mobile.
All the news, all the time. AlJazeera.net/English.
As protests, violence, and the call for political reform spreads across the Arab world, Al Jazeera's in-depth coverage of events on the ground brings you the news as it breaks. Ongoing coverage of the Libya uprising on Al Jazeera.
Thank you.
Oh, no. It's an astonishing moment.
We are globally yours.
Colonel Gaddafi's brutal attacks on his own people are unacceptable and will not be tolerated.
For the future of Libya and its people, Colonel Gaddafi's regime must end and he must leave.
International pressure builds on Libya's embattled leader to go. Hello, I'm Sheila Ghosh. You're watching Al Jazeera live from Doha with our ongoing coverage of events in Libya. We're also getting reports that Muammar Gaddafi's son is arming his supporters to fight back. Also coming up, Egypt's top prosecutor targets ousted President Hosni Mubarak, banning travel and freezing his assets. Now we start with reports of fresh protests against Muammar Gaddafi, which have broken out in the Libyan capital of Tripoli, with reports of security forces opening fire. Now that comes as international pressure mounts over the ongoing unrest. European Union ministers in Brussels have agreed to slap their own sanctions on the country's leadership. Libya also topped the agenda at a meeting of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. Hillary Clinton, the US Secretary of State, has said that Gaddafi has to go. We'll have more on the diplomatic moves shortly, but first the latest on the ground in Libya with Lawrence Lee.
You'd be forgiven for thinking that if a town only half an hour from Tripoli is in the hands of protesters with tanks, then the end must surely be near. Yet the days drift by, momentum ebbs and flows, and for the time being Gaddafi's regime has enough to avoid falling to the people's uprising. Given the routine way in which Gaddafi's armed forces have been switching allegiances over the last few days, one of the questions that keeps being raised is how are the Gaddafis maintaining a fighting force? Up until now, the chief spokesman for Gaddafi has been his son, Saif al-Islam. He has routinely accused the media of lying about the fighting. Maintaining Libya is entirely at peace with itself.
The point that you are hearing rumors, false reports, please take your camera tomorrow morning, even this night. Go to every city in Libya. Everything is calm. Everything is peaceful.
And yet this has now emerged. The same man, semi-automatic in hand, exhorting people to fight for his father.
I'm here to raise your morale. They are spreading rumours that our police and security forces are joining the hooligans. It's not true. Today we'll show them that the police are siding with Libya. I'm bringing you reinforcements, resources, food, weapons, everything you need.
Discounting the irony that Saif al-Islam Gaddafi has warned about the prospects of civil war while seeming to arm a militia is the question of the extent of Gaddafi's regular military forces. This is the Bainin air base, said to be one of the most important in the country. The military here say they've joined the uprising.
The whole base responded to my call to join the People's Revolution. We have great staff. As military personnel, we want to be clear that this is not a military coup. We are not leading anything. This is a people's revolution led by the youth. Our role is to protect and support it. That's our main aim.
While the Gaddafis offer arms to civilians, their former army in eastern Libya has left behind a fearsome arsenal, now in the hands of the insurgency. They say they're trying to look after it in case children get their hands on it. It also promises to provide them with a massive buffer against a Gaddafi fight back. So the east of the country does now appear far more stable, and attempts are being made to suggest a country after Gaddafi. But there's still nervousness about a civil war, not least among poor migrant workers who, many days after their bosses, are finally getting out.
Here is facing war and here is going on war, so we are afraid, everybody is afraid here, what maybe we can die and die.
Away from the headline towns, it appears that little places are quietly realigning themselves, and in a small country that could be genuinely significant. This Facebook video is said to be from Zintan, southwest of Tripoli near the Tunisian border. Enough men with arms here to protect a fuel convoy. And this video, also from Facebook, is from a tiny looking place called Kakla al-Jabal. They raise the flag of protest here unnoticed, but it's another community lost to Gaddafi. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera.
Now, in the past few minutes, the US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has been speaking on the sidelines of a UN Human Rights Council meeting in Geneva. She said that Colonel Gaddafi's brutal attacks on his own people meant that he had lost legitimacy, and she said it was time for him to go without delay. She said the aim now was to further isolate the Gaddafi regime. She also spoke about the huge concerns at the humanitarian situation inside Libya. Let's discuss this further with Tariq Youssef, Senior Research Fellow at the Dubai School of Government, who joins me now in the studio. Tariq, the point about Hillary Clinton's visit to Geneva, addressing the UN Human Rights Council, is to boost the international response and to strengthen the determination against Gaddafi. Is it working?
I think it's working. It's piling up a lot of pressure on the regime in many ways, not just morally and psychologically, but also materially. She used a couple of phrases that I think are quite key. One is when she didn't use the phrase, no options are off the table, she said all options are on the table. She also suggested that the theater of action is going to be mostly in Europe. These two phrases suggest to me at least that the military option is alive and will be exercised if the world comes to it. Two, that they're considering possibly sanctions that will target oil and gas exports of Libya, which are two things that Europe is precisely the destination for the majority of. There's been an accelerated effort by the international community to respond. I think not only options are on the table, but potentially scenarios that will react should Gaddafi take the battle to a much more escalated level of violence and bloodshed in an effort to retake the cities.
I mean, talking of military intervention or possible military intervention, certainly she hasn't ruled it out, but she hasn't ruled it in. And a lot of people in Libya, a lot of the opposition protesters are saying they don't want military intervention, although they would welcome a no-fly zone. They would welcome a no-fly zone.
They would welcome possibly an effort to take out Gaddafi himself and his barracks. They will not welcome foreign invasion, what would be perceived to be a foreign invasion, ground troops stationed in Libya. But they would welcome a swift end to this that would at least help avoid the civil war scenario that many people have been extremely concerned about, and she talked about as well.
The aim clearly is before that, before military intervention is being considered as a possibility, is to have Gaddafi's remaining supporters to peel off from him, to peel away from him, to further isolate him. Do you see signs of that happening?
I have no doubt that there are contacts between the outside powers and some of the commanders around him, some of the political generals around him. The hope is that they might defect or at minimum help weaken the regime even further. There's also possibility in the scenario that some of these commanders would take matters into their own hand and help end the fight within the particular barracks where Gaddafi is hunkered down at the moment. I have no doubt that these contacts are taking place. Whether in fact they will materialize or not, they are an important option, and they will be an option to be considered before a military option by external powers.
And of course, she was very concerned about the humanitarian situation. In fact, a lot of concerns about the humanitarian situation. France is sending plane loads of aid to Benghazi. The US is sending humanitarian teams. I mean, what is the reality on the ground? Have you spoken to people in Benghazi?
Everyone that we've spoken to in the last 24 hours is reporting, in fact, that more and more of this externally provided medical supplies and food supplies are entering the country. Shortages have not been reported widely yet, but it is only a matter of time with Libya being cut off for a country that imports about 85–90% of its food needs and medical supplies needs, for the shortages to kick in and potentially create a humanitarian crisis within the country. It's also the case, and I think the external powers are extremely worried about this, that Gaddafi could use the humanitarian crisis as a card to create chaos, to create confusion, and to help essentially negotiate his way out on his own terms.
Tariq, thanks very much indeed for that. Tariq Youssef speaking to us there. Well, to Egypt now, where the public prosecutor has issued a travel ban on Hosni Mubarak and his family pending further investigations. He's also ordered a freeze on their financial assets inside the country. Mubarak's the most high-profile and most senior official of the previous regime to have a travel ban imposed on him. Ayman Mohyeddin has more.
forced out of office and now in the crosshairs of Egypt's prosecutor general. On Monday, former President Hosni Mubarak and his family were banned from traveling abroad and all of their financial assets and property in Egypt frozen, pending further investigation. Mubarak and his family had reportedly accumulated